will you pray with me? God, you are ever present with us. You call us from memory to hope, and from hope to action. Bless all those today who mourn. May your grace set their feet to dancing. May the words of my mouth and the reflections of all of our hearts bring you glory. Amen. Amen. You will remember that we are in a series of sermons focused on hymns, and the hymn I chose for today's inspiration is There Is a Balm in Gilead. There are times when I wish that it were as simple as the words of this comforting hymn. And while I want to affirm the wholeness of which this song speaks and its availability to all of us, we do not always take the same paths. Today is the 10th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania. We were different people 10 years ago, and in the intervening 10 years, we have all traveled diverse paths. But here we are on this day, together as a people who came to worship and praise the living God of all of us. First, I know that we may have among us some who were among the many workers who spent countless hours and days and the months just after the attacks. If you are here, would you stand? The rest of us would like to say thank you. I know there are many 9/11 services going on today. Thank you. If you are among those who lost loved ones and friends at any of the 3 locations, please know that we care and pray for God's continued peace. For the rest of us, we all have different tales to tell. I lived in New York State, close enough that many friends lived and worked in the city. I sat with hundreds of thousands of others that night in churches and waited throughout the night for word. The days that followed were hard to describe, even as far north as where I was. Churches scrambled to do what they could. Traffic slowed to a crawl as hundreds of firefighters collected money for the relief efforts. Flags flew from every car and house window, while still some waited for work. I heard the stories of tragedy, and I heard the stories of miracle, the toothache that kept someone in a dentist's office rather than in the towers that day. Life nearly came to a standstill as folks could think about nothing except how they could help. I want to tell you my own story of my journey to Ground Zero. Not because it is particularly unique, I assure you it is not, but because it taught me so much about being wounded and about being whole. On the Sunday after 9/11, which would have been 3 or 4 days later, my church had collected another truckload of food and supplies for the relief workers, but no one stepped forward to drive the truck to the city. We were supposed to go to Siemens Institute, which for those of you who know the city, now that's about 20 blocks north of Ground Zero. Now this will not come as a surprise to you, having driven a U-Haul truck on one cross-country trip, decided that I knew enough about driving a truck to get behind the wheel and take off for Manhattan. A good friend, fearful for my life, went with me. Let me acknowledge to you right now that God drove that truck to Ground Zero. The pedals were so far away that I had to sit on the edge of the seat the entire time in order to reach them. The 2-hour trip took close to 8 hours. New York City police greeted us. They had been informed of our arrival because all arrivals had to be logged with the police department. And they told me they needed to escort us directly to Ground Zero as all later, the police car stopped and I learned my first lesson about being wounded and whole. A big, burly New York officer got out of his car and came back to my window. And he said, "We're stopping here because you will want to take a few moments to prepare yourself for what is ahead. At the next turn, we will be at the towers." I assured him that I would be okay, and he nodded with sad wisdom. "Just take a few breaths while you are here. You may not be able to breathe very well when we get there." I looked at my friend, shook my head at the officer, and started praying for strength. Mostly I was amazed that in the midst of all they had seen, they were lovingly concerned about the impact the scene would surely have on me and my friend. It seemed to me a beautiful thing then, and even more so now. As I restarted the truck and inched forward, I began to notice the ashes hanging from every surface of every building as we got closer. Suddenly, when we turned the corner, the police cars disappeared, and we were in front of the mass of twisted steel. As I got out of the truck to find the exact location where the food was needed, I learned that just minutes before our arrival, word had come from the city that the mission was changing from rescue to recovery. That meant, of course, that it had been determined that no one could be left alive. The sadness that moved through the hundreds of people at the site was so real that you could feel the weight of it mixed in with the fatigue and sorrow. But not 1 ounce of hopelessness was there. Not in the faces of the rescue workers, not in the sad eyes of the rescue dogs who longed to be back in the pit doing their job. It was as if the earth moved, but not the people standing on it. I watched in amazement as firefighters who had been on mandatory breaks simply picked up their gear and said, "Then we will find their bodies." This, my friend, is the story of wholeness coming in the midst of woundedness. I remember saying, "God bless you," to one young firefighter. There really wasn't much else to say. He looked at me and said, "Thank you." In that simple exchange, this young man changed my life as I came to understand in a completely new way how important it is for us to care. I came to understand in ways new to me in that brief encounter that my fear and pain, as real as it was only a tiny little part of the greater woundedness of humanity. I realized as I stood in the shadow of the twisted remains of buildings and lives that God still triumphed in the resolve of those workers and rescue dogs not to leave anyone behind. I had 2 degrees in religion and most of a 3rd one, and not one single time had I learned as much about God's love as I did in that single moment when this young firefighter showed me with his eyes how much my love and care meant to him.